So welcome, thanks everyone for coming along. I know there's a lot of great sessions and following that keynote as well. Joe and I were just speaking. It's a tough act to follow, so really appreciate everyone joining us. So just as a bit of an introduction, my name's Kath Bryant and I'm the Higher Education Partnerships Manager here at MyTutor. And what we'll be doing today in our session is having a look at how university access teams have adapted to everything that's happened during COVID, and it does discuss any challenges that you may have faced this year in measuring participation efforts against quite hopefully a unique background of the last 2 academic years. We're being joined by Warwick University. They're going to talk through the methods they've used to help A-level students combat learning loss and the widening attainment gap for entry into higher education. So as a bit of context, this year we know there's been a huge push to rebuild pupils' confidence and to help close the attainment gap, especially for those from disadvantaged backgrounds. And obviously it's been reported lots of times that disadvantaged students are much further behind, but due to COVID, it's added maybe another sort of 7 months potentially to that gap. So how we're going to work today, first of all, I'm going to kick things off with a really brief introduction to MyTutor. For those of you who haven't come across us before, apologies to those of you who have, but then I'll also then be handing over to Joe Bowers, who's the Widening Access Officer at Warwick University, and the lovely Fran, who's an undergraduate student currently studying at Warwick, who took part in Warwick's University Scholars programme last academic year. Our hope is that you can take some concrete insights away from these talks and really enjoy it and engage with it. During the webinar, if you would like to submit a question, the chat box at the bottom is the place to do that. And there'll be some time to put those questions to Joe and Fran at the end as well. So just wanted to talk briefly about why we're here and a bit of context about MyTutor. We've been partnering with higher education institutions and schools to deliver online tutoring for over 5 years. This was initially born out of the need to provide disadvantaged students with high quality and personalised and also scalable tuition. With the events of the last 18 months, it's clear that these attainment gaps are only going to be getting bigger. And with the government investing so heavily in tutoring through things like the National Tutoring Programme and COVID catch-up, MyTutor has been supporting more students than ever this academic year. But what is it that we actually do? As a brief overview, we're an online tutoring platform that's designed to reinforce classroom learning and raise students' attainment and confidence. We match pupils with university students who deliver tutorials in Key Stage 3 to 5 across English, Maths and Science. The lessons themselves are subject specific and tailored to help support students in raising their attainment and confidence in the areas that they need the most. All of our tutoring's live and personalised and can fit around school or student timetables down to individual students. As mentioned, we recruit our tutors from university, so all of them are either current students or recent graduates. We're quite selective in who we actually allow to be a tutor on the site, and only about 1 in 8 get through our recruitment process and then go on to do a training course before they're live on our platform. This is to ensure really high quality programme delivery so that schools and students engage with it even more. They're subject specialists and have exam experience that act as a near-peer role model for the pupils that they're working with. As I mentioned earlier, all of our sessions are live. Students and tutors can see and hear each other and work together on this interactive whiteboard space that you can see here. The lessons are recorded, so they can also be watched back as a revision tool as well. So as a higher education institution, there are a few ways that you could work with MyTutor and might have come across us before. Firstly, some university partners use us to support disadvantaged offer holders with A-level tutoring to ensure these students get support that they need for university entry. And Joe, I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. We also work with Key Stage 4 students. Commonly, this is through Uni Connect partnerships, but also some universities themselves as well, who are using MyTutor to provide programmes for target pupils within their partner schools, offering this really high impact intervention to improve results a bit more generally at GCSE level. This works well because we're quite flexible. We can work with large cohorts of students across schools, and you can easily track it through an online portal as well. Schools really like it. We have high levels of engagement from schools themselves, because they can see that the impact it's having on student grades, and ultimately that's, you know, one of their main aims to support students. It's also scalable, so regardless of the number of students on the programme, we can deliver you know, lessons at varying times. We manage setup and day-to-day delivery as well, and you can see some of our partners down here. So that's plenty from me, I think. If you would like to hear any more about MyTutor, you can email me. I've put my email on there, but it's just kath@mytutor.co.uk. Or we're having a drop-in session, which I think was mentioned earlier. That's over lunch, so we'll be there to answer any questions that you might have as well. So now it's time to hand over to our wonderful guest speakers. Do remember to pop any questions that you have in the chat box, and we'll be popping those to Jo and Fran at the end. As a brief introduction to Jo and Fran, Jo's worked at the University of Warwick since 2018 as the Widening Access Officer. In her role, she's developed and launched the Access part of their Warwick Scholars programme, which supports students from underrepresented groups in the Midlands to reach their potential, get into Warwick and thrive during their studies. Before this, Jo was a teacher of languages and a deputy head of a sixth form before moving into higher education in 2017, working on the NCOP, now UniConnect in Birmingham, for 18 months before moving to Warwick. And Fran has just completed her first year of studying film and literature at Warwick, having completed the Warwick Scholars programme in 2019. As a first generation student starting her university degree in a pandemic, Fran has made the most of this support that the programme has to offer, and has become one of the university student bloggers and a Warwick Scholars mentor as well, which I'm sure she'll tell us more about shortly. So yeah, handing over to you now, Jo and Fran.
Thanks, Kath. Thanks for that, and thanks for having us to speak. I hope that everybody finds it useful, and I'm very open to questions. Yeah, like as we go through and at the end, about how we've found working in the pandemic. Basically, it's a nightmare, as you all know. So I'm going to start off talking a little bit about what Warwick Scholars is, because I think it's important to have the context of why we've included tutoring in the programme, and how we kind of came to develop the programme. So as Kath said, I came to Warwick in 2018 with the express kind of challenge of developing and creating an access programme to Warwick, which didn't exist before. What we did have was Warwick Scholars as an undergraduate programme, existed in its infancy, and that's actually developed massively in the time that I've been at Warwick too, with the team that I work with. So from small beginnings in 2013, Warwick Scholars was a bursary for 9 students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds who were embarking on their undergraduate studies at Warwick. And it's since grown into a comprehensive programme of activities, opportunities, experiences designed to support students to make the most of their time at Warwick, I guess, their education. So by 2020, Warwick Scholars had grown to over 300 students, and it will continue to grow. So the plan is that in the next few years, we'll be up to about 1,000 students coming through and onto Warwick Scholars. So there's a couple of ways to get onto the undergraduate programme, but my part is the Warwick Scholars specific access programme. So I'm here to talk to you primarily about that access part and how we've maximised student engagement throughout the pandemic and in partnership with MyTutor. So the access programme has a real focus on academic attainment, transition to university, community, confidence building, and success and progression while at university. So it is kind of part of our life cycle approach that we run at Warwick. Next slide, please. Playing Chris Whitley. Thank you. So when I came first into post, the first thing we needed to do was to analyse what the issue was that we wanted to address, and we did this by looking at our current Process 16 programmes that were already being run and the destinations of the students that took part in those. So we run Realising Opportunities, and we run a couple of Pathways programmes, so Pathways to Law, Pathways to Banking and Finance, and recently Pathways to Engineering. Obviously those are run in collaboration with the Sutton Trust and with Realising Opportunities, and obviously all of the other universities that take part. And what we found was that we also ran a Warwick specific one that was kind of a Key Stage 4, Key Stage 5 programme called Unitracks. But what we found when we analysed the destinations is that there was a really low conversion rate to Warwick from these programmes. And while that's fine because we consider a positive destination as a positive outcome, we did wonder why, excuse me, why aren't they choosing to apply to Warwick? Why aren't they getting in if they do apply? So that's kind of where the programme came from. And we found that almost 65% of the students on those programmes with us were attending universities within an hour of home. So we knew that there was kind of a demand for local university places, but it kind of led us to the hypothesis that students want to stay close at home for uni, including going to kind of higher tariff universities, but for whatever reason weren't seeing Warwick as a viable option. So we set out to try and find out why that was. And we did this by talking with focus groups of students and staff in kind of target areas, which isn't vocabulary that I like, but basically areas in the local region where progression to university was low or socioeconomic disadvantage was high. And as perhaps it's because we're a Russell Group University, I don't know, but we tried to be as evidence-led as possible in our kind of work and believe that there should be kind of no discussions about us without us. So that's why we went to talk to potential participants, potential schools, to find out what they actually felt and what they wanted rather than assuming we knew. So we also, on top of that, looked at some of the existing literature and research around the barriers to university participation and how we might best be able to eradicate or at least mitigate those. And so what we found, go to the next slide. So what we found were these were kind of the main issues highlighted. So grades were perceived to be a really big barrier to entry at Warwick. So our entry grades are quite high, and it seemed that they felt too high for students, even for students who then went on to achieve those grades. So many, it appeared, would prefer to kind of play it safe and apply somewhere that they felt sure that they would be accepted. And so we developed a kind of meet in the middle approach. So we offered a reduced entry requirement to Warwick, a significantly reduced entry requirement between 2 and 4 grades below the standard entry, depending on the subject, and certainly better than the contextual offer available for that subject. But at the same time, we wanted to focus strongly on academic support during the programme so that students could continue to meet their full academic potential but feel safe in their application to Warwick. So that's that kind of meet in the middle approach. We wanted to enable them to feel that Warwick was an option and help them to get there if that's what they wanted. So secondly, we found that finance continues, despite all of our really hard work across the sector, to educate people around how student finance works. It continues to be a major barrier in participation at all. And so we developed a generous financial package for the programme, so including the 50% tuition fee discount and a maintenance bursary. And this financial commitment, I think, really highlights the university's commitment to widening access. And then there was a kind of less tangible, but very prevalent sense that Warwick wasn't for them. And so we developed the programme to have a focus on building a community of Warwick Scholars. So that goes throughout the kind of probably 5 years that students are part of the programme. And the reality is that 1 in 4 students at Warwick is in receipt of an income assessed bursary, but for whatever reason, that doesn't appear to be this perception in the region, and people feel that it's not for them, and that the kind of working class, or however you want to describe it, students aren't at Warwick, and it's just not true. And we kind of wanted to create a community so that students knew that there were people like them at university. And so a kind of key aim of the programme is to make the participants feel part of the Warwick community before they get there. There was also a sense from students and teachers that there was a lack of confidence amongst students around applying to higher tariff universities. The sense maybe that it was a wasted choice because they wouldn't get in anyway, that kind of thing. And that kind of held true for students who then went on to kind of, again, and not a term that I enjoyed, but undermatch. So go to universities with grades higher than they needed to get in, choosing, because it appeared from speaking to people, choosing a university that they felt confident they'd get into, even if they could have got into a higher tariff university. I take completely on board that might have been a very well-informed choice, and that's absolutely fine. But that didn't seem to always be the case from the kind of insight from the students and the teachers. So as I've mentioned, our analysis showed that students were staying close to home, but not considering Warwick, despite an interest in the university or the courses, and despite having the ability to get in. So we decided to make this a regional programme for students in the Midlands, which allows us, or did at least, to bring them onto campus regularly and enables them to have an informed choice about the options available to them. And so there's no requirement for them to put Warwick as a choice. It is a programme to support students to get into Warwick. So if they don't apply, then we they come off the programme, and we support them with all of their other advice and guidance around choosing a university. But there's kind of no hard feelings. If they don't apply, that's absolutely fine. If they don't have to put us as their firm choice, but they do need to put us as one of their options, because it's about supporting them into Warwick. So it just wouldn't be as relevant if they weren't planning to come to Warwick. But there's no kind of, it's not really a recruitment programme in that sense. It is about widening access to Warwick for students who are already interested in that, and just trying to take away some of the barriers in place. So this is what a typical programme might look like. It's kind of in a timeline form. So it kind of runs from the summer of year 12. So we've literally just finished assessing applications for our newest cohort of students. They'll have their residential launch event in August. So typically in a normal world, that is a kind of like a summer school, but it's just for launching the programme. And the focus on that is to kind of kickstart year 13. There's a focus on study skills that are going to be useful for year 13, so revision skills, learning skills, time management, those sort of things, as well as kind of launching the programme and getting to know the university. Obviously, last year and unfortunately this year, those have been and will be run online, which doesn't have quite the same level of impact, but we've still managed to create a really nice community feel, and that's kind of one of the key things. And obviously we've still been able to kind of help students with study skills and things like that through an online platform. So hopefully we'll go back to residential as soon as possible, because I think that really is one of the experiences that kind of kickstarts the whole thing really nicely. But at the moment we're still looking at doing that virtually. Then we support students to attend open days, both at Warwick and elsewhere if they need the support. So with travel and stuff like that. Obviously if they come to Warwick, we're able to kind of hold sessions for them specifically for Warwick Scholars. We then support them throughout the first term of year 13 with their UCAS application. Again, whether they are planning to come to Warwick or not, they still get this level of support. That involves kind of talks from some of our admissions tutors around how to apply. They also, as you'll see on the next box, get mentoring from a current undergraduate Warwick Scholar, and that's kind of one-to-one online mentoring, and they can use that mentoring to help them with their UCAS application, choosing their universities, writing their personal statement, that sort of thing. That mentoring starts typically in the first half term, or the first term of year 13, and runs throughout until kind of about now, so the end of year 13. And so they can ask their Warwick mentor absolutely anything they want to around going to university, about Warwick itself, about the UCAS application process, finance, choosing accommodation, all kinds of things come up in those conversations. And then it's the one-to-one online tuition, which we've run through MyTutor for the past 2 years. So I'll talk to that in a little bit more detail next. So that starts in like January, February time and runs up to their exams. Obviously, the last couple of years we've not had exams, and I'll talk about that in a bit more depth shortly. So then we also bring them onto campus to visit with their department. When we were able to bring them onto campus, they basically shadowed students throughout for a couple of days, like going to lectures with them, going to lunch with them, getting a real sense of what it's like to be a student at Warwick in the department that they're planning to join. So this is that part of about community building and getting to feel part of the Warwick community early, so that the transition is less jarring. Obviously last year we weren't able to run those in person, so those were run online, kind of pre-recorded lectures and seminars to get a taster, and then meetings with key members of staff in the department and other students to kind of just get to know each other. We help them with student finance information and guidance, and then with revision support throughout really, but we also hold an A-level boot camp for specific key subject areas. So I want to talk a little bit more now on the next slide, please, about the tutoring. So attainment raising is a key aim for Warwick Scholars. It's something we can support with, but we do recognise that we're just a cog in the larger machine of a student's educational and social context. So we know that we're not going to be able to make huge amounts of impact on their grades. So, but we are able to support in some way. And what we hope for is that in having kind of this one-to-one tutoring, the student obviously improves in that specific subject area, but there are other transferable skills that they can take away to their other subject areas around kind of how to revise or how to write an essay, how questions need to be answered, that sort of thing. And what we also find in a kind of ad hoc way is that because the students are being tutored by current undergraduate students, there's a little bit of advice and guidance that comes naturally through that. So whereas their Warwick Scholars mentor might not be studying the same subject as them, their tutor usually is. So they might be able to give a little bit more insight into what it's like to study, say, chemistry at degree level, for example. So students are entitled to a set number of sessions as part of the programme that we obviously pay for them. And they run kind of once a week for several weeks in the run up to the exams. So we usually start them around February and then they run up to kind of May sort of time, ready kind of to kick off exam season. The students themselves choose which subject to have the tutoring in. So I did a little bit of a survey of the current cohort of year 13s, and so 2/3, 65% of students chose their perceived weakest subject. So the subject they felt they needed the most support in is the one they chose for their tutoring. Other reasons that they gave included wanting to practice subject-specific skills or exam techniques. For example, a couple chose languages and they wanted to practice speaking. Others wanted to choose an essay-based subject because they were having trouble writing essays and structuring them as they needed to. Some focused on the subject they were applying to study at university because they felt it would help them most with their transition. And others felt like there was a lack of support in that subject at school. So tutoring can support students in disadvantaged, perhaps underfunded schools where, for instance, they might not even have a specialist teacher for one of their A-level subjects. That's something that we found quite a lot, where a student doesn't have, say, a further maths teacher who's kind of specialist in further maths, for example, or perhaps they've got a physicist teaching them chemistry A-level, something like that. And this support kind of really makes them feel more confident. So this year, these choices were made in January, which was right in the middle of lockdown and home learning. And so I think in some ways that meant that the students were in some ways better placed to make that decision because they knew by then which subjects they were more or least likely to get enough or to feel like they got enough support from school in the online learning kind of sphere. Next slide, please. So in terms of how we can monitor their tutoring, we have an attendance target of 80% of sessions. We know that sometimes, you know, life happens, especially in a pandemic, people get ill. They're not going to necessarily be able to attend all of their sessions, but we do have an attendance target of 80% of sessions, and students need to meet that unless they've got a good reason in order to pass Warwick Scholars, which is what enables them to meet the conditions of their kind of lower offer and get onto the undergraduate programme and that sort of thing. And what's really helpful for that with MyTutor is that the portal that as a kind of staff member you get, it allows me to monitor their attendance really easily. So I can see a percentage, I can actually see each session and whether they've attended it or if they were late or if they haven't attended it at all. And I'm also able to see tutor comments, which in the main are really good from the tutors, like quite comprehensive. Occasionally you get a tutor who's a little bit, doesn't write loads, but that's I think true of kind of anyone, any service. But in the main, they're really useful tutor comments, and that enables me to see if a student is struggling more than perhaps they thought they were, or more than they were previously. And sometimes I've got kind of spare hours that I can maybe top up their tutoring hours, for example. And it helps me see, whether the students are engaging really, and whether they're kind of turning up on time, doing the work, turning up prepared, that sort of thing. And the students and the tutors between them agree what to focus on and plan their learning between them. So it kind of encourages independence and self-reflection from the Warwick Scholars participants, because I'm not their teacher. I don't know what it is they need to work on. We do encourage them to talk to their teacher of the subject they're having their tutoring in, so that they can really focus. But I think this, giving this kind of independence is really important for the transition to university, where they've really got to be independent and kind of leading their own learning. So they are year 13 students, they are very committed students, and they are bright students. So we find that that works really well. Next. So in terms of the pandemic impact, obviously, basically the pandemic hit in about, I think it's 5 or 6 weeks after we'd started the tutoring for the first time. So we haven't had a round of tutoring kind of as planned yet. And as I'll mention in a second, that's kind of impacted how we've been able to evaluate the impact of the tutoring. So the pandemic hit in 2019-20 when exams were cancelled about halfway through the tutoring programme. And if you remember, at that point, we really didn't know how grades were going to be awarded, what was going to happen about exams. As you'll probably remember, it was quite late until we knew what was going to happen. And then obviously we had all of the issues around teacher assessed grades and things like that. So what we did at that point was we kind of drew a line, stopped the academic tutoring and repurposed it to become kind of transition tutoring. So we repurposed it from away from A-level towards kind of university transition. And MyTutor were really helpful actually in accommodating our requests to try and pair the majority of Warwick Scholars with a Warwick student on the same or very similar course. And that kind of been an easy task, so I do appreciate that. And so, for example, if a student was having their tutoring in maths, but they were going on to study biochemistry, we tried to pair them with a student either studying biochemistry or biology or chemistry. And the purpose being that they could really focus on the skills that they were going to need to succeed in year one and kind of hit the ground running. And we kind of were helped with this by our academic colleagues in the departments, who each department highlighted kind of 3 to 5 key areas that students could focus on that they thought were the key things they needed to know, either from kind of the A-level syllabus or kind of relevant to the year one programme at Warwick in that course, to make sure that they could really kind of get going, hit the ground running, succeed from the off. And so what that meant was that it enabled study to continue over the summer, which allows students to feel more prepared for university after much longer than normal time off. So in terms of how we can measure the impact, as I said, exam cancellation in both years that we've run it so far has meant that we've not been able to robustly assess the impact of tutoring on grades, because we haven't had actual grades to use kind of to assess. But student perception has been that it's been really useful. So 89% of students last year said the tutoring was very or quite useful before the exams were cancelled. And there was a slight drop to 77% who found the transition tutoring very or quite useful. But I still think that's really pleasing and really high, considering the situation that students found themselves in. And actually the kind of survey that was done here was right at the start of their year one studies. And I think it's possible that some of that was before they'd had a chance to evaluate really for themselves the impact that transition tutoring might have had. And we have had quite a lot of qualitative evidence from students around the impact of the tutoring through student surveys and interviews. And I've just got a few quotes to kind of illustrate that really. So obviously a lot of people said that it helped them to consolidate their understanding of what they were doing in class, which was at that point, of course, online, but also allowed them to briefly understand the specific university course. So in this case, it was philosophy. And I mean, I won't read them all because you can all read, but essentially there's a lot of feedback that having the tutoring really helped them to feel prepared for uni, it really helped them to succeed academically. A lot of them said it would have definitely, but they felt it would have benefited them in their exams if they had sat them. And so I think, you know, in the absence of kind of quantitative grades and kind of data, this qualitative evidence points towards it being a really worthwhile part of the programme. So then in 2020 to 2021, current year 13s, the programme actually started before exam cancellation was announced, but then it wasn't actually long into the tutoring that we found out there weren't going to be exams, but at this point at least we knew that it was going to be teacher assessed grades quite early on. And so this time we decided not to go down that transitions side because we had longer that we knew what was going to happen, but also because we knew it was going to be teacher assessed grades, we knew students were going to be having to sit assessments and kind of prove their grades for their teachers and stuff like that. So we actually encouraged students to rearrange their tutoring so that it was all completed before assessments, but that was optional. So, you know, most students knew by then that they were going to finish school, say, at the end of May, but perhaps their tutoring had been planned to go on into June. We encouraged them to kind of have maybe 2 a week and to plan it themselves. So again, putting the onus on the students to manage their own learning. And some of those have opted to not rearrange their tutoring and to save some for more transition or consolidation work. And I think that's really important because the feedback we're getting from students is that there are some courses where they've maybe almost skipped a whole section of the syllabus because you know the teachers were setting the exams and there just wasn't time to cover it and all of that. And so they've wanted to really consolidate those areas they felt they weren't able to do in their teaching. And so just a few kind of stats from a recent survey we did with the students. So what we can see from here is this is kind of the before and after their tutoring, how they felt about certain things to do with their grades. So we can see that there's a clear increase in feeling confident about getting the grades, feeling like their A-level learning's going well, knowing what they need to do to reach their targets, and feeling like they had the resources and skills to do well. And so I think, you know, these are students who are really bright, really committed anyway, right? So we've got high starting points here in the before survey. But to see an increase and to see the high levels of confidence is really kind of really impressive and really speaks to the fact that the tutoring has had an impact. And again, so 97% of students have said that they found the tutoring very or quite useful this year. And 58% of respondents said that the tutoring had improved their confidence. So specifically, I asked the question, how do you feel the tutoring has helped you? And they brought up confidence. So that's not, you know, tick a box, that's they've used the words confidence or something related to improving their confidence in their studies. So in terms of the challenges we've had this year, we have seen attendance drop ever so slightly, but still very high at 86%. And I think it's fair to assume that that's from kind of virtual fatigue. Everything's been online. You don't want to necessarily sit down and do another online session after you've done a day of online learning. Exam fatigue is a real big thing. I mean, we had one student who was sitting in an assessment or an exam every day for like 3 weeks. They were sitting in an exam because the teachers were so desperate for evidence to give them obviously the best possible grades. So there was, you know, they were struggling to even find time to do their tutoring. We have seen that post-exams attendance has dropped for those who didn't rearrange it. So I think moving forward, if we were in the same position again, we would kind of make that mandatory to make sure that the most is made of the investment in the tutoring. And I would argue that this group have had actually much more disrupted studies even than the 2019-20 cohort that Fran was in, and she'll talk to you a bit about how she found it. Because obviously their year 12 was disrupted and their year 13, and probably their first year of uni is going to be disrupted to some degree. So I think to still have this high level of attendance is really impressive from the students. And I would say in the wider programme sense, the lack of being able to meet them face to face has made community building a lot more difficult, but we have managed to do that through kind of informal catch-ups and things like that, but it isn't the same as it was last year. And so I think you'll hear from Fran that one of the things she liked most about the programme was meeting people who are now at Warwick with her. And this cohort, I think perhaps are not going to be in quite the same position or not have the same kind of levels of friendship. But in terms of positives that the pandemic's brought, obviously we've been able to continue with the programme. We've actually been able to offer more support because we've been able to offer more sessions virtually than we would have physically. So there's been improved access to things like UCAS and student finance guidance and advice. More students have been able to attend more things because they were virtual. So we were able to run them at a useful time. We haven't got to get people onto campus, that sort of thing. And so I think some of those things we'll take forward into the programme anyway, even after the pandemic. So when we're thinking ahead, we're expecting, I think, to run a hybrid model of delivery, so some face-to-face events and some virtual. And because we found that running informational things virtually means more people can attend, we can run more of them, and if people can't attend, they can kind of watch a recording or something. So we find that we're able to actually get more information out there. I mean, one key concern that we've got is that the next group of students to come through will never have sat formal national exams, so they haven't sat their GCSEs, there's been no AS levels for those who did them. And so tutoring and academic support, I think, are likely to be more important than ever. And one challenge could be that perhaps they won't realise how important that is because they haven't had that exam season. They might not realise how important tutoring and revision and really keeping on top of your work could be. And so we will need to focus more during the rest of the programme on the importance of those study skills. So the other thing to think about thinking ahead is, just click forward, I think, is about evaluation. So we're going to struggle again to evaluate kind of statistically because of the grade situation. So we will look to gather insight from teachers as to whether they've noticed a difference from the tutoring, so a bit more qualitative evidence there, but from a different source. And we will also look to include teachers more closely in the choosing of subjects and what to focus on in tutoring sessions and kind of try more of a partnership model there. And we're going to have to continue to be agile in our response to how the pandemic affects exams and everything else. You know, you all know if you're working in universities that it's just been a couple of years of trying to put out fires and think about how to do things in the fairest way possible. And we'll continue to do that, and we'll continue to advocate for our widening participation students in that process. And so I'm going to hand over to Fran, who, as Kath said, came through the programme, is currently a first year at Warwick, came through Warwick Scholars last year. She's going to talk to you a bit about how she found it, really, and her perspective. Over to you, Fran.
I offer student perspective of the programme. I thought this programme was important when I first joined it, but I think in the pandemic it's more important than ever with the challenges that have been faced. It's both important academically, but also socially, being able to meet people from similar backgrounds to you. When I had the tutoring, I chose to be tutored in Othello because I felt it was my area of weakness, and that lines up with what Jo was saying from her survey. I also didn't feel very supported from my school because I was quite an independent student generally. When I told my teachers that I was struggling, they were just kind of like, "Oh, you'll be fine," but I didn't feel fine. So when the tutoring was offered to me, I knew that that was what I wanted to focus on. So in a more practical sense, I worked with my tutor to target areas of the exam specification that I was struggling with. So historical context and critics was particularly important for the exam board I was doing. And that wasn't something that my teacher had really taught us. She was focusing on the plot of the play, and you can't excel if you don't know those things. So before the tutoring, I was getting an E, and in my last assessment before the lockdown, I got the A. And I really think that this helped me, not just academically, but also mentally, because before the tutoring, it was something that was really making me feel stressed, because I didn't know how to move forward, because I didn't feel I was being supported. And ultimately, it did improve my teacher assessed grades, because previously it would have pulled down the higher grades that I was achieving in other areas. The transition tutoring I had was also important, because it re-engaged my academic brain. As Jo mentioned earlier, it was quite an abrupt ending to my A-level experience, and I was quite nervous about university in ways that I hadn't been before, because I thought, I haven't done anything academic in so long, like, how am I going to handle this, and never mind a new level of academic study. So I was matched with transition tutor that studied at Warwick. She studied English, and she taught me the referencing style, which was something I was concerned about as a first generation student, because I didn't really have any family members that had to do that themselves. So that was useful, so that she could train me how to do that, so that when I eventually did an essay, it was a bit less overwhelming. As she was also a first generation student, it was useful. She understood where I was coming from, and her experiences weren't too far from mine. She was only a year ahead of me, so it was still recent enough that she could see where I was coming from. I gained confidence from the programme, both socially and academically, and I think it's important to meet other people from similar backgrounds to you, because, as Jo emphasised earlier, a lot of people feel that university, especially Russell Group's universities, aren't for them, or they don't belong, and that isn't true, but it can help you feel better if you realise there are other people like you, and I'm sure people have done that virtually, even if they can't do it physically in the same way I was able to. But also, as I'm a wheelchair user, it was a benefit of the programme that I was able to be on campus for the pandemic, learn about the disability and access support, so I could see the different accessible rooms that were available to me, set up a access plan, meet the disability advisors, because although finding the right course in the right place for me was important, if it wasn't accessible, then I wouldn't have been able to go there. So that was really important in making me feel confident and going to work, really through just creating a sense of familiarity. And although people might not have that as much this year because of the pandemic, they'll still see people they know around, like Jo or Andy or other Warwick Scholars.
Thanks, Fran, for that insight. I think it's really always really nice to hear from someone who's taken part and to how they found it. And I don't know, over to Kath, but we're kind of finished and we're happy to take questions. I think Kath kind of managed them.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's so interesting, Fran. Thank you so much for telling us about your experience as well. We've got a couple of questions in, and we don't have huge amounts of time, so I'm going to go from the ones that were sort of submitted first, and if it's okay with you, Jo, I'll invite, if anyone does want to send me any additional questions to pass to Jo, I can do that at the end as well. But first of all, a question from Samantha for you, Jo. She asked how many students are on the Warwick Scholars Access Programme, and what do you find the conversion rate is?
So it's quite a new programme, and we purposely kind of started small, and there's a growth plan that's quite ambitious, I would say. So we've had 2 cohorts. We had around 99 students, exactly 99 students start on the first year, and we had a conversion rate of around 66%. Some of those decided to apply elsewhere, which, as we've said, is absolutely a great outcome if that's the right place for them. Some kind of went to even higher tariff universities and that kind of thing. So, you know, it wasn't very many, although I don't know the data off the top of my head, that didn't meet the grades. That wasn't, whereas previously that had been a key issue. This year, I mean, we launched the second cohort in literally the week of the pandemic. I think we launched it on the 18th of March last year for recruitment. And so we had a really kind of difficult recruitment round. So we had the same number of applications, but they were actually less eligible, and we're not about filling places with students who aren't eligible. So we had about 85, and we're kind of projecting a similar sort of 65% conversion, but obviously we'll see what happens with results. Yeah. And then for the next cohort, we've got 150 places we're about to give out. So there is a growth.
Fabulous. Sounds like an exciting year next year as well. Some unique challenges, as you said, for those students. Yeah. We've got a question from Becky, who's asked, said that she'd be interested to know how, if you were able to avoid any deficit model perceptions among students in their transition to Warwick, thinking about the possible feeling of imposter syndrome, particularly among students about to progress to this year who have sat exams.
Yeah, that is a key concern for us. And I think the way that we tried, I don't know yet whether we've been successful because it's such an early stage in the programme, but the way we tried to do that is to be really honest about the realities. So as we've said, there's 1 in 4 students at Warwick who are on a bursary of some sort that's income assessed, so that perception of everybody's rich and posh just isn't a fact. We tried to be really open about that. We tried to be open about the number of students that come in with a contextual offer, for example, and we've worked really hard with our departments to make sure that there is, well, to try to make sure that there isn't that deficit sense. And actually, a lot of the students, they come through, they don't rely on the lower offer. And that's what we've tried to get over. We don't want you to rely on this. This is a kind of safety net so you feel confident, but you need to reach in your potential, because it's going to be important after your degree. You know, your A-levels are still looked at. I still have to give my A-levels when I apply for a job. So we kind of try to emphasize that to avoid that deficit model. And I think the community aspect helps, that they know other people who've come through Warwick Scholars, and they get to know even more that on the undergraduate programme, so they know they're not the only ones, because I think that is a clear concern, that they might feel like they're the only person in a massive lecture theatre who came in with, I don't know, 3 Bs and everybody else has got 3 As. Not always the case.
Yeah, absolutely. And sorry, I was just going on mute there because there's been some building work going on upstairs. So it's do you want to interrupt?
Yeah.
There are a couple of questions left, but I know that we're sort of 3 minutes over time now, so I don't want to hold people up. So just want to say a massive thank you to everyone for coming along. And thank you to Joe for sharing all that information, and particularly to Fran for joining us and giving us such an interesting insight to your year last year, and congratulations on everything you've achieved. It's really impressive. So thanks so much for coming. If there are any questions, as I said, do feel free to email me, and I can pass anything along to Joe if there's any burning questions remaining there too. And
I'm going to be here for the rest of the day, so you can always drop me a message in the Zoom, like a private one.
Fabulous.
Please feel free.
Amazing. I'll also be in the drop-in session today at 12:15 in 10 minutes or so. So if there's anything anyone would like to know, feel free to pop along. Thanks again for joining.
Thanks for listening to us.